Hello and welcome to this review of my Model F122 Reproduction keyboard. This was produced by and donated by Joe, who's done the other Model F repros as well over at modelfkeyboards.com. I've reviewed some of his other keyboards as well, but I was especially stoked for this one, as someone producing a Battleship keyboard in this day and age is pretty much unheard of. And I like big keyboards, and I cannot lie. For those who don't know what a Battleship is, it's the nickname that the original keyboard had, which I also happen to have one of. This is part number 6110347, and it's a very late one, produced on the 26th of March 1986, originally designed for the IBM 3270 terminal. It was a version of what IBM internally called Keyboard F, nowadays more well known as a Model F, because that's what's shown on the model sticker, and is generally referred to as the F122 on account of its number of keys. The name Battleship comes from its gargantuan size at 56 by 23 centimeters, or in imperial units, it's the quadruple bypass burger of the keyboard world. The Model F was the predecessor to the more well-known Model M keyboard, which is the one that came with the PS2 computer and which has achieved legendary status within the keyboarding community. They both use buckling springs for their key switches, but the Model F uses a capacitive sensing assembly, whereas the Model M uses membranes instead, and it's generally agreed that the older Model F produces a lighter, crisper and more satisfying key feel than the later Model M. Which is saying something, because this is already one hell of a keyboard. More on the switches later. Joe had already made repros of the smaller F60 and F77 Kish Saver keyboards, which were a fairly direct reproduction, not to mention an earlier iteration of his formula, but for these F122s he's made several more direct changes, and some other things have matured as well, such as the firmware. Again, more on that later. As the original was an all-terminal keyboard, it had a layout which nowadays would be considered strange and unwieldy by most people. There's no escape button, or actually anything in the location where an escape key would be. There are no lock lights. I think lock status was shown on the terminal screen instead. The three keys that normally go here are missing, and the nav cluster has this awkward cross-shaped nav in it rather than the more familiar inverted T layout that we're accustomed to nowadays. Though with some rebinding and replacement keycaps that more closely reflected what the keys actually do, you could mitigate some of these issues, but I never found it to be quite as usable as the more familiar 102 or 101 key layout. Joe's Repro F122 has been redesigned to work a little bit better in the layout department. Apart from shaving a bit off the bezels on the edges, making it just a tiny bit more compact, he's given it a modern nav cluster with an inverted T, an escape button here, print screen, etc. here, a lock light bank, and keycaps that actually say what the key does. Except this one here, which isn't a control key, it's an FN key by default. Now, I'm not actually sure why you would need an FN key on something with this many buttons, but I guess it's there if you need it. And the two blanks here are Windows and menu keys respectively, of course. They are also an addition over the original, which had empty spaces here. I'll also straight up say that I think it actually looks a lot better. It doesn't have as many empty spaces, like here and here. Plus, the locklight bank makes it look more like a real keyboard. It just has a more elegant impression overall, I think. The one exception, of course, is that the IBM badge on the original is much nicer than the buckling spring one on this repro, but I guess there's no way around that without invoking the anger of the Colossus of Armonk. The bank at the left is for use with macro keys. The original had a bunch of weird terminal functions on this, but for a modern application, obviously you can use it for something much nicer. One of the advantages of a Battleship keyboard is, of course, that you can rebind it for use with macros and other shortcut keys, which is very nice. I'm always a big sucker for macro keys, so I like this very much. By the way, fun little extra. The keycaps for tab and caps lock are the same as on the original, they're terminal type, though the caps lock on the newer one isn't stepped like the original one is, which would have been a nice addition. His first repros used QMK to configure them, which I absolutely detest personally, but his current generation of keyboards use new firmware which is compatible with Vial instead. This is a massive improvement in my opinion, because it means that normal people can now also use it. The construction has changed as well. The original had an unexpected structural weakness in that the top cover was made of a very hard, brittle plastic, which was wont to shatter. This was fixed in the Model M keyboard by using PVC for the housing instead, which didn't have this issue. Joe chose instead to make the entire housing out of metal, which is of course much nicer, but the weight is actually the same as the original at pretty much exactly 4 kilos, or in imperial units, minus 0 degrees flubber height. That's right, this thing weighs roughly twice as much as a Model M. It's an absolute monstrosity. Very few keyboards exist that outweigh this thing, and even fewer that are compatible with modern computers. The reason the weight is the same, despite the original's plastic top cover, is because instead of a metal plate as housing, it was built on top of a massive metal pan which held the construction together, and this was made out of pure steel, rather than the zinc or Zamak that Joe used for his keyboards. Of course, the steel backplate and steel mounting plate helped the weight along a fair bit too. Unlike the original, which had a pair of absolutely massive 2-stage flip-out feet next to the pan, the enclosed bottom on these Repros leave no room for flip-out feet. It's normally supplied with just cork pads instead. He actually forgot to include them in my box, so I stuck on some other ones myself. I use a desk pad nowadays, but you definitely need some sort of padding, or this behemoth is going to scratch up your desk something awful. The cable is a non-detachable braided USB cable. Now, I've read several comments of people that don't like that it's not detachable or coiled or beige, but personally I don't mind too much. It would have been a nice extra, I guess, but I think it's okay. Plus, it's nice and long. The originals wasn't detachable either, by the way. The keycaps are Repros as well. They have slightly sharper edges than the noticeably more rounded corners on the original, and they are one piece instead of the 2-piece ones on the IBM, which, if memory serves, were originally developed for this very model of keyboard actually. Joe took ages trying to perfect these, something about letter placement and sharpness of the print, but the result was worth the wait in my opinion. These are excellent. For reference, they are super thick PBT and use dye-sublimed printing. The switches are extremely crisp and satisfying. It's an absolute joy to type on them. The tactile event is as clear as fresh spring water, feel nice and smooth, and actuation is inherently synced up with the clicky noise, which only a very small amount of switches can boast of, and no, Cherry MX is not one of them, by the way. Also, because it uses capacitive sensing, the keyboard has inherent N-key rollover, unlike the 2-key rollover that the Model M was limited to. The typing sound is noticeably different from the originals, though they both have the characteristic sing-songy twang sound of buckling springs. In the new version, you can hear the flippers trill inside its compartment after the flipping, which adds a rather shrill after sound, whereas this noise is absent in the old model, and as a result, I don't think it sounds quite as nice or as crisp. Of course, it is also extremely loud. The Model F is perhaps the loudest keyboard I own, and I own over 500 keyboards, and this one clearly follows in its forebear's footsteps in that regard. Now, this sound is quite divisive. People who hate clicky switches are obviously going to detest this, but it's also got many fans. Personally, I love it, and I'd go as far as to say it's part of the Model F experience. You know, it just wouldn't be the same if it wasn't as loud as a machine gun. So, lots of fantastic stuff so far, but what's the catch? Well, it's the same as on all of Joe's Model F repros. It's this little pamphlet, aka the green booklet of death. What's in here? The limited warranty. This mentions that small defects that occur during shipping, and which can be repaired easily by the end user, both functional and cosmetic, are not grounds for return, and this has been a greatly polarizing factor with these boards. Basically, during shipping, sometimes the paint gets chipped or some springs become slightly dislodged, which will cause that switch not to work properly. In order to fix it, you need to push the springs back down, for example with some tweezers or chopsticks. Joe has a bunch of tutorials on how to do this. Now, this is generally not that hard or anything, but obviously no one likes to do what is effectively out-of-the-box day one maintenance, especially for an expensive product like this. I mean, this is a $400 keyboard. This, plus Joe's unfortunate tendency to lash out at criticism, has rubbed some people in seriously the wrong way, and one or two viewers on this channel go absolutely berserk and start foaming at the mouth whenever they see any videos on his keyboards pop up, seemingly having made it their life's mission to bring his business to his knees or something, which strikes me as a rather disproportionate and unreasonable response. That said, the maintenance is generally not all that hard, and the thing that it all boils down to in the end is that, frankly, this is just an extremely good keyboard that's worth putting some time into. The juice is worth the squeeze, as they say. Plus, if it arrives genuinely fucked, it's still covered by warranty. I mean, you're not going in completely naked here, so to speak. Another thing to note is that the keyboard generally arrives without the keycaps attached. Now this is because they can misalign during shipping, so now he's just leaving them off. Again, putting these on is really a piece of piss. A toddler can do it. Just remember to put the keyboard on its side like this, or the springs won't properly line up with the angling pin in the sliders. Now, honestly, I can see why the limited warranty can put people off buying this, and if this notion really bothers you, then yeah, you probably should just stay away from it. But many people, including me, have had fantastic experiences with these boards, and I at least think it's worth it. I think if he had included a full warranty, he'd have had to charge vastly higher prices, and it's already an expensive board. So while this limited warranty sucks ass, I mean, it really does, at the same time, I do get why he does it like this. And speaking of the price, the base cost is $400, but there are loads of options too. A solenoid for added noise, because, you know, it's way too quiet otherwise, is $65. Mac keys start at $30, the badge is $7, and much, much more. A special note is the first aid kit, which is things like spare springs and flippers, and that is $50 extra. Now, that last one I really think is a bit rich, because reattaching those springs comes at the risk of breaking them, and without extra springs you're fucked. So if you're expected to do out-of-the-box maintenance, I think it's more than fair that you should get a bunch of them for free. Overall though, when you get it up and running, I think this is a spectacularly good keyboard. I can't describe to you how nice this is to use. It's a Model F Battleship with an improved layout. I mean, this has got to be one of the best keyboards ever made. What more is there to say? That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.